Good day, everyone. I know this always takes a minute for the people to actually come into the room, so we will just give this a moment and be together in the awkwardness of Zoom coming together. And now I think I will go ahead and get started. It seems like the room is filling up nicely. Welcome, everyone. My name is Mac McFarland. I'm the Executive Director of Converge 45. And thank you so much for joining us today for Cleanse, a dialogue on art in public space with Paul Farber and Michelle Angela Ortiz. Really looking forward to their presentation and the conversation afterwards with the artist and educator, Jaleesa Johnston. I want to begin today by saying that our activities here in Portland, Oregon take place within the traditional homelands of the Multnomah, Oregon City Tumwater, Watlala, Clackamas Chinooks, and the Kaliapuyia people who were forcibly relocated to the Grand Ronde Reservation in 1855. Today, these tribes are part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. The Grand Ronde people continue to maintain a connection to their ancestral homelands and maintain their traditional cultural practices. Today is the second part of a two-part series, Reimagining Portland, Parks, Public Space, Memory, Creativity, and Spatial Justice. These talks have been co-presented with the Portland Parks Foundation, the Regional Art and Cultural Council, Portland Art Museum, and Converge 45. And I really just want to take a moment to say what a pleasure it's been working with everyone in that group. And I'm really looking forward to further and deeper collaborations in the near future. The first of those talks took place on March 17 with Liz Ogbu, who framed a large discussion on spatial justice in the ways one can design it. The video of that amazing talk is on the Portland Parks Foundation website, as well as Converge 45's. Today's conversation is also part of Converge 45's second in our series of programs called Portland's Monuments and Memorials. This work is bringing people together to consider the conditions and the impacts of public monuments in Portland, those that have come down and those that remain and that should be built. We're trying to work to build together, to knit together a artistic activity with the civic dialogue to examine history, public space, and markers of our tragedy and successes. Part of the way they're doing that are conversations like the one today, our previous talk with the artist Chess Perlitz, the historian Reiko Hillier, and the artist Allison Sarr on her work on Lewis and Clark's campus, York Terra Incognita. We have a future talk in May with the artist Basira Khan in collaboration with PNCA's graduate program. And we're also collecting ideas of what kind of monument or memorial you want to have in your neighborhood through our open call. These responses will be shared in an online forum within an exhibition at the end of August, and finally in a publication to come out at the end at next year. You'll be able to find all of that on our website at converge45.org. And as the co-presenters did following the Liz Ogbu talk, today's conversation will be followed up with community dialogue to explore these issues further with a smaller group of community members, social justice activists, and creators. I really want to thank everybody who's been involved in this with all the organizations. It's been really amazing to work with you. And now I'm going to turn this over to Kristen Calhoun, who is the Director of Public Art for the Regional Art and Cultural Council. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Mac. It has definitely been a pleasure to collaborate with all the organizations and with individuals. We just wanted to give you all a quick welcome. We're really glad you're here to be part of this really important conversation. We're really interested in how things move forward. And then now it's my pleasure to introduce another one of the collaborators, our facilitator for today, Jaleesa Johnston. Jaleesa is an interdisciplinary artist, educator, and arts administrator. She holds a BA from Vassar College and an MA from the San Francisco Art Institute. She's been the recipient of an AICAD postgraduate teaching fellowship and Centrum's Emerging Artist Residency. In addition to her role at the Portland Art Museum as programs lead in the Learning and Community Partnerships Department, Jaleesa also teaches in foundation, photography, and video and sound at the Pacific Northwest College of Art. welcome, Jaleesa, and thank you for leading this conversation for us today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kristen. And hi, everyone. It's been really awesome to be a part of the conversations taking place in this collaboration. And I feel really honored to be here, to be able to facilitate conversation and to be able to introduce our speakers today. And with that, I would love to introduce Paul Farber and Michelle Angela Ortiz. Paul Farber is director and co-founder of Monument Lab, a public art and history studio based in Philadelphia that cultivates and facilitates critical conversations around the past, present, and future of monuments. The lab works with artists, students, educators, activists, municipal agencies, and cultural institutions on participatory approaches to public engagement and collective memory, and to make generational change in the ways art and history live in public. Paul M. Farber is author of A Wall of Our Own, An American History of the Berlin Wall, and co-editor of Monument Lab, Creative Speculations for Philadelphia. He also currently serves as Senior Research Scholar at the Center for Public Art and Space at the University of Pennsylvania Weitzman School of Design. Michelle Angela Ortiz is a visual artist, muralist, community arts educator, and filmmaker who uses her art to represent individuals and communities whose histories are often lost or co-opted. For 20 years, she had created community engagement methods that take into account the issues of responsibility, accountability, and ethics within the field of social practice and community arts. From murals to temporary large-scale installations, her public artwork shares stories using richly crafted and emotive imagery to claim and transform spaces into a visual affirmation that reveals the strength and spirit of the community. And with that, the floor is yours, Paul and Michelle.
Great. Thank you so much, Jaleesa. Thank you so much, Mac, to Kristen, to everybody here. And of course, Michelle, it's so wonderful to be here with you.
Same here. Thank you. Thanks to everyone that has put our talk together, and we have the ability to be at least present virtually with everyone and to share our work.
Yeah. So, we have been collaborating and been in conversation for at least 5 years, if not more, and we get to talk a fair amount together and conspire together. And we thought, for the purposes of today, taking that conversation and sharing it with you all here, but also giving us a chance to kind of fold out and have some reflection as well, because we realize that a lot of times when we've been working on projects and they're really tactical and focused and strategic, we don't always actually get a chance to step back and ask each other questions. So that was the kind of premise, and we did not realize that we actually were wearing matching Kelly green or Philly green.
Philly green, yes. So we are both coming to you all from Philadelphia, and we realized that we're wearing our Philly green today. But that's true. It's like what Paul was saying is we usually do not have these moments of just reflection and also making connections with all the work that we have been doing all these years. And so this is really a treat to sit down and have this conversation with you, Paul.
Likewise, Michelle. We said that we would ask each other questions, and then as we normally do, detour both kind of with purpose around really important, serious issues, and also around the spirit of art and how art connects, art cleanses, art is a force of reckoning, art is a force of dealing with legacies of division. But one of the things we realized, we haven't had a chance to ask each other origin stories. And so I want to just kick off asking you about when you realized you were on a path to become an artist.
Yeah, I always speak to my foundation as an artist, not necessarily beginning in a traditional art school. I mean, I went to art school, but for me, where I live and situated, I'm still live on the same block, on the same neighborhood that I was born and raised in, here in South Philadelphia, right by one of the oldest outdoor markets in the United States. And the market is filled with immigrant vendors and immigrant families, really creating a space, like claiming space, but also creating a space where they can raise their children. And so my family is part of that story. We've been here and settled here. I'm a child of immigrants and settled here now 45 years. So it's definitely rooted within this community. And so I talk about how the vendors place their fruit on their fruit stands, how we would thinking about like spaces and how we engage in spaces. So the songs that my father would sing and the boleros, to the dresses or the colors that we would wear, to creating paper flowers for events or holidays that we would have in our home. And so my interaction in terms of murals or graffiti murals were really around what I saw in the streets, right? Not necessarily going to gallery, going to museum, but what I encountered in public spaces. And so I feel that that really is part of my foundation as my interest as an artist in going into public spaces, working with communities that are coming from very similar experiences that I have gone through and my family has gone through. But I think that it wasn't until I really saw myself as an artist as a young teenager, where I was given the opportunity to take classes at different art schools for youth programs. And then eventually, because we live in a city with many murals, created my first mural when I was 20 years old. And prior to that, I was already doing some mosaic work. So I really found this sense of connection in a way that, I was processing a lot of these ideas of like stories and narratives and how we share these stories in my own studio practice when I was an undergrad. And but I felt that the extension of those concepts and thoughts and connecting it with the community and involving the community, engaging the community with and asking themselves those same questions. That's really when I saw the possibility, right, of really the direction of my work within these past 20 years. So how about you, Paul? I mean, that was one thing that when we were discussing, I was like, how was Monument Lab formed? Because Lab has just existed. So I was really interested. There's the like written form of like, okay, this is Monument Lab, but I would love to know about how that came to be.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would say it's just, anytime I hear part of your story and your journey, it's always just deepens my respect for all of the work that you do. And there's so much more I know we'll get into today, but I just want to say that. And I feel like I do want to give a kind of story of the collective of Monument Lab, but also I feel like it might be helpful to even ground a bit in kind of how I entered to this thing that ended up being Monument Lab. And I think part of the story, and I think we've talked about it, but just a reminder that, my story of why I'm in Philadelphia, my great-grandparents on my mother's side were Jewish immigrants fleeing pogroms and violence in Eastern Europe before the Holocaust. And they entered South Philadelphia at the port on Washington Avenue. And they walked 3 blocks to 2nd and Christian. So we're talking like where our people have found themselves are like 6 blocks apart, approximately 6 to 8 blocks. And then they had a push cart and then a small deli, which I like to call a Jewish bodega because of the amount of the way it's been told to me of what was there and what role it played. And so it's just like for so many people in Philadelphia, that whether as immigrant or migrant or refugee communities, like South Philly bonds us and also marks this particular kind of history and way to see the city. So, you know, I think, like, for me, I'll share part of where I feel like context for Monument Lab might be important. For me, you know, I grew up in Philadelphia. I'm Jewish, I'm queer, I'm a white person. And I grew up in a city that proclaimed itself as about history and art. And I too had all of these experiences, like seeing the history of the city as something expressed in monuments and historic architecture like Independence Mall, or symbols like the Liberty Bell, but also murals that told a slightly different story. And part of that story that I remember really like experiencing as a kid was at our city hall, which has on top of the building a statue to the colonial founder of Philadelphia, William Penn, and it faces the direction, as you know, come to know, of the site where the Lenape people, through Chief Tamanend and William Penn and the British Quakers, made a treaty that was meant to last as long as the creeks and rivers flow and the sun, moon, and stars shine. It would take a generation before William Penn's sons and his colleagues perpetuated a massive land theft called the Walking Purchase Path. I think about like what it meant to be in Philadelphia growing up, and you hear on one hand the stories of like this, you know, I remember like the tourism jingle was Pennsylvania, America starts here. But knowing that when you listen to other kind of stories, or you followed murals, you followed novels, you followed the work of poets, realize like actually democracy and injustice are really braided together here, much as they are everywhere as well. And that is something, as a process, I remember starting just even as a high school student, riding the train into the city, my first internship at Philadelphia Weekly, and just thinking about seeing the skyline out of one window and then seeing neighborhoods out of the other, and wondering what was that relationship and what was the past, the present, and the future of the city. The other big thing for me was writing my dissertation about American artists in Berlin. And I was very hesitant to go on one hand to Berlin, and very compelled to go. I had grown up my whole life being told, don't go there. It's too much of a site of trauma, too much of a wound. And like anywhere you're told not to go, you know, especially as an artist or a historian, you say, well, let me figure what that's all about. I felt more comfortable being Jewish and queer in Berlin than I did anywhere else in Europe when I was an undergrad student studying. And I just remember this feeling while there that there was such a heaviness to the air. It always felt like you're almost like walking through like a viscous material. But there were Holocaust memorials that were big as city blocks, and then some as small as cobblestones. And there was, in addition to monuments and memorials and markers, there was a reparations program for Jewish families. There was a curriculum. There was laws that kind of backed the kind of transformation. And I just, you know, it's not a perfect place. It's not ideal. They have a heavy weight of history, but I remember being there thinking a small sense of relief of, and actually a big sense of relief of not having to live a lie, to not have feeling like things are whitewashed or pushed under the rug, but that the scars of the city and the process of memory that was out there, all the different techniques, made me feel like I could be there. And it made me think about, where does that live in the United States? And so I kind of had that feeling of like, well, this is a place that is both incredibly traumatized and has been a site of remarkable transformation. You know, I ended up writing a book about people like Angela Davis, Audre Lorde, Keith Haring, artists who were haunted by and felt at home in Berlin, a divided city before and after the wall was up. And then came back to Philadelphia. I had been away for 10 years. And I kept running into pieces of the wall, the Berlin Wall, in American public spaces when I was researching, like in subway station, in Chicago, underneath the Space Needle, at the food court in Seattle. And I put that energy into a class I was teaching called Memory Monuments in Urban Space in the fall of 2012. I met Ken Lum, who was new to Philadelphia at the time. He moved from Vancouver, and he also was teaching a class. And we realized that we were teaching classes in a very similar way, where we didn't have all the answers, but we wanted to ask questions. who is being represented in Philadelphia's statuary and traditional monuments, and who did the representing. Why was it in our city that was a majority Black city, that's a space of multicultural, multi-ethnic energies and histories, that there were at that time in 2012 no monuments, traditional monuments to people of color on city land. But Ben Franklin's face was and likeness was on it was 3 places on the north side of City Hall alone. And as I found out, you know, I have family in Portland, and my nephew attended Franklin High School. So his name perpetuates everywhere. There's a lot of that space. But then when you looked outward around the city, you realize like there were 4,000 murals that represented history in a different way. There were house museums, there were protests. And at that time in 2012, and as the project progressed, we really felt like we were late to the conversation, because already more than a generation of artists, activists, students had been calling attention to the discrepancy between the symbols of our city and others and the systems of justice. And so we said, like, well, we have to take the spirit of mutual learning, of art making, of provocation, and figure out how to move outside of the classroom into public space. And so last thing I'll just say about this origin is Ken and I met, and we're figuring out, I had just finished my dissertation. I didn't have a job. I ended up getting the last job I applied for. Just a shout out to everybody doing their work, trying to figure out how to get to the next step. And I remember I talked to Ken, and he didn't have a job for me, but we realized that we said we were kindred spirits. And I ended up getting a postdoc at Haverford College, the last job I applied for that year out of like several dozen. It ended up being a really special, nurturing place for me. But Ken then called me over the summer and said, okay, I have an idea. I want to make a negative history festival, because I think we only have positive history, and I want to do the negative history. And I thought, that's so brilliant. I'm so excited to do this. I can't get people in my city, I was thinking my family even, like, come and be negative history festival. And so we're like, let's take that and let's shift. And so the first other name was the Ambivalent Memory Festival, because it was like pulling. And then Monument Lab became the way to imagine what would come next.
Awesome. I mean, it's been a journey, right? And so I think that's the people don't see the development or the kind of like the evolution of these ideas and these connections. So I think that it kind of definitely gives a nice grounding around it. So my next question for you, Paul, is, you know, I really like, what brings you to this work? And I think you touched upon some of that already in your origin story. But I think right now, what brings you to this work?
Yeah, and I'm going to turn around and ask something
Yeah.
similar right to you. You know, I think that, you know, I've seen the power of memory that is not isolated to behind museum glass or elevated on a pedestal far above, but like what it means for family, what it means for neighborhoods, what it means for organizers, what it means for artists. And that memory takes so many forms. And so I think that, you know, even in a city, cities are places where we try to innovate and we figure out what's next, but there are also places where there are wounds, where there are traumas, where there are challenges that precede the city itself. And so a lot of this is thinking about like, a path forward I constantly find is about memory. And memory is challenging because there is no pure form. There's no pure form of history. There are gaps, there are erasures that really matter in it. I think, you know, one of the ways, again, ways forward, a way of care, a way of innovation, is to think about how we bring our past with us. I mean, we are all imprinted upon with not just DNA, but other kinds of experiences that you can spend a lifetime unfolding. And then I think the kind of investment in this work is seeing that, you know, like I say this, it sounds like wordplay, but the difference between a statute and a statue it's very difficult to reckon with policy, especially those that have been built in antiquated, harmful ways. There's a reason why people protest at statues, why they long to tear them down, or why they aim to build their own. And it's because those are kind of like tips of the iceberg. And so I feel like there's a lot to learn constantly about the way that people hold space in public. That includes some like the official stories, but I'm more interested in how spaces, how symbols accrue meaning over time. And so I think like all of that is connected to believing in the power of art and history to be transformative, to be a part of justice projects, to be coalitional. But it comes also from that spirit of trying to imagine ways we inherit this world, we walk into it. What do we do with it? Where do we find our way? And whether it's for yourself, for your community, or building coalitions around you. And then just finally, truly, I think about, 2 words of the last year, reckoning and reimagining. And like, what does that mean? It's something that I think we need more of both.
Mhm.
And so I'm really grateful to have not just, for Ken and I, but all of the Monument Lab folks, past, present, and future, and the Monument Lab fellows and artists we worked with, who are also asking questions. And those questions are aiming to find points of connection, of reckoning, and of reimagining, to think of history as a living force that doesn't, is not punitive, but history as a window to experience and sharing. But now I ask you, Michelle, the same question. And I'm imagining it's either, well, I'm curious if it has changed over time for you.
I think it's, if anything, it's a lot more simplified, I would say, right? I think the thing, I've done murals and well, the piece that I did, Seguimos Caminando, for Monument Lab's citywide exhibition in 2017, Seguimos Caminando, was thinking of it as a moving monument. So taking some of those elements of the community engagement processes that I, really is about building relationships, is about connecting with community members, building on trust. And as you mentioned, like the concept of like coalitions and building with coalitions, building, I see Monument Lab as a way of building with artists, and the way that I see my work. And we spoke about Philadelphia and specifically all these symbols of freedom and democracy and definitions of what liberty and freedom are. And for me, what's interesting is presenting a counter narrative, right, to that, because for whose freedom, for whose liberty, right? And so what brings me to this work in particular is really about creating visual platforms for these stories to be heard, to be seen, and not just about creating awareness, but with the intention, I think now even more, of sparking people into action. And so building some sustainable or strong relationships and figuring out how I can still be an advocate. There are organizers and activists that do organizing 24/7, right? And so how do I connect and build with those organizers and support their work? And how can the artwork also present something else that cannot sometimes is lost within the urgency of sending out a message, getting someone to sign a petition, having someone to, just taking action because of the injustices that exist. And so where can we find space, for me in particular, thinking about creating pieces that help reinforce that human connection, that are both powerful and poetic, and give space for those conversations of not just, let's say, a mother seeking asylum that's been detained, and she's not telling her story for a court case or for a particular campaign, but she's sharing with me a song that she sings to her child, to calm him and to keep him safe in the middle of, you know, the system of mass incarceration and detention, immigrant detention. So what I would like to do, if it's okay with you, is to share actually the 2-ish minute video of the Seguimos Caminando piece, which I, during this time, it was right in between, I was in between the phases of Familias Separadas project, which is a public art project that I started in 2013 to highlight families that have been affected by detention and deportation. And I see it as like a stone thrown in the river. So it's kind of rippling from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And now I'm working with different communities in Colorado, North Carolina, and New Hampshire. That's some of the work that I'm working on right now. But the Seguimos Caminando was during the time I was visiting the mothers in Pennsylvania, the state of Pennsylvania. We have a family prison, one out of the 3 in the United States. The other 2 are in Texas. But this is the oldest family prison that incarcerates families seeking asylum. So these are parents, adults with their children. There have been children as young as 9 weeks old that have been detained in this facility. And there's been a continuous fight now over 5 years, I believe, with the Shutdown Burkes Coalition, which are organizers, statewide organizers that have been fighting to shut down this prison. So the animation that you're about to see is based on 2 stories of 2 mothers. And then the voice that you're about to hear is of one of the mothers that I had seen within the 5-month period. And she was just released, I think a few days after this recording, and she was able to actually record and read her story. So the voice that you're hearing is the voice of Lorena that also echoed through the city hall and echoed in that public space. So let me pull that up. I'm so sorry. Here we go.
Caminaba por la casa de mi mamá sobre el suelo de tierra. Jugaba con mis hermanos, meciendo la hamaca de multicolores y envueltos de árboles, de jocote y cerezas que bailaban con el viento. Junto con mi mamá íbamos al río soleado para bañarnos. Años después, jugaba con mis hijos en ese mismo río. Un día me amenazaron y me tocó irme, dejando a mis hijas. Entre llantos, me llevé a mi hijo de 2 años y una mochila de ilusiones estancados por el tiempo.
So that was just one excerpt from Seguimos Caminando, and I want to also share the Flores de Libertad, which I can speak over this. So one of the things that with the exhibition of Monument Lab in 2017, there were the projection or the animation that was mapped onto the gates of City Hall, the north gates of City Hall. People were able to see it at least in the evening, which is kind of the complications around projection. So I wanted to create something that could be seen during the day. And while I was visiting the mothers, as I mentioned, I used to do paper flowers with my grandmother for our celebrations. And so the idea was like, okay, I can't bring any art materials within the confines of the prison. Let me bring these paper and pens. And the mothers created about 20 flowers that were then installed. So what you're seeing here are 1,600 paper flowers installed on this in front of the actual site of City Hall, and then it was shortly followed by a press conference with the Shut Down Burkes Coalition. But just as a representation of the flowers coming out of the confines of the prison and then assembled into this piece. And through Monument Lab, we actually, I don't know if you remember, Paula, the whole piloting the space at the Barnes Foundation. We had many people come, and really what was interesting, I think, during that time frame was like folks were looking at the paper flowers and not really understanding, like they just saw the artwork after going to inside the Barnes to go see like Van Gogh or Monet, and encountering our team in creating these paper flowers. But the act of creating the paper flowers felt like sitting down for a meal. And so it actually opened the space to speak to family detention, to speak to this is happening in our state, and then to have people also write their messages of freedom for the families inside. So I think that it was a nice connection between the animations and the projections that were happening in the evening, but in the daytime, thinking of it as this moment of like activating that space, and lending it as also a space for the organizers to then hold a press conference, because that really garnered attention around the area.
Yeah, I mean, I'm reflecting back on like what it has been like to work with you over the course of 5+ years. And I think a through line that I find, and I think every artist in some ways either takes us on, or if they don't, they push it away. But something that you do so powerfully, one, the work that you do is beautiful, is meaningful. Like I've been in your studio, I've seen the long arc of your work, and an artist is aiming at creating something from their own hands. And like, what is beauty? We may have different versions of it, but the care that you put into craft, and that's the case if it's a piece of art going up in your community or in a museum or an embassy or somewhere else around the world. And then you have participation is part of your process, not for everything, but you mentioned these kind of moments from Monument Lab 2017 where you said, no, I actually want to organize people. I want to bring them in a room. I want to welcome them in, but I want to make sure that I'm using this as a strategic purpose. And then, of course, as you say, like your relationship with organizers. And we've had a lot of conversations about what an artist can and cannot do, what an artist is responsible for. But I have to say, as you showed the vision of Libertad outside of City Hall, just to be very clear, it was made over the course of about 6 months or more for the purpose of the day the governor of Pennsylvania would show up at City Hall to have a rally. And at every moment, whether it was with an art press or whether it was with the local newspaper or PBS, you would say, all right, I want to say my piece, but I have to make room here for the legal team, for the organizers. And so I'm sharing that as an appreciation. It's a real modeling of like art as about beauty and the beauty of relationships and connections that are implicit in all art projects, as some push it away. But I guess, like, how do you balance that? How do you balance being a producer, someone who like wants to make things and sign your name to it, and also being aware and responsible to being in coalition with folks who are not artists, but you're building a bridge between your work and their work?
I mean, I think that I don't know if this is I don't know if this is an American, like USA concept, like it's like very individualistic culture, right? And so I understand, and I know deep within my DNA and where I'm coming from with in terms of the experiences that I've had, as I mentioned, as living here, being raised here, as a child of immigrants, and just seeing that how my family navigates, how my community navigates, how the communities I connect with navigate, even the mothers that were detained at this detention center, how the mothers that had been there for, I don't know, over a year became a resource to the newly arrived mothers of like navigating that system, how to take care of themselves. And so it's this concept that like we really cannot do anything on our own, right? I mean, that's what I also see within the structure of Monument Lab and how it works, right? We talk about consistently like, okay, who's the right person that can join our team and figure this out? And so so I always say that I never really think of, you know, Michelle just doing this by herself. Like that's impossible. I do think that it is about, you know, this kind of definitely comes into the conversation of ethics and responsibility, right? Within social practice, within community arts is, when I think about relationships, there's of Roberto Bedoya, who's written about around creative placemaking. He always says, you know, how are we good guests, right, in these spaces? And knowing, for me in particular, you know, there's things that, you know, I don't ask questions that I'm not willing to answer. I'm very clear about what my intention is, right? And then also acknowledging like, where is my intention coming from, right? And that also means acknowledging my own privilege, right? You know, when I was doing the work with the mothers at Berks, and as I'm continuing to do this work with undocumented communities, I can relate on certain aspects of, you know, being a product of two people that experience extreme poverty and being the main reason of why they immigrated to Philadelphia, to the United States, and how that also trauma is embedded within our bodies and our minds, right? Within our spirit. And although I haven't necessarily dealt with that, that trauma is passed down, right? Because our perceptions or our fears or the decisions we make are also influenced by some of those, that unresolved trauma as well. And so I just say that because as I think about like establishing relationships is, you know, the main thing is just understanding myself, my privilege, where I stand, right? Then the other thing too is just, okay, why am I interested in this? Why, what brings me, like we spoke about, what brings us to this work? How do I feel connected or disconnected? And then also just, this is not, if this is not my particular, what is it called? Firsthand experience. How do I open a space that is safe, that is mindful, that is about building trust for folks that are, in the case of Berks and with Seguimos Caminando, for the mothers that are being traumatized by this event? How do I create spaces of healing beyond than just like, oh, I need to get this artwork finished, right? And I think that that's, I think also, you know, within the art world and what we, at least what I experienced as a young art student, you know, it's really like the artist vision. And I have a vision, but at the same time, it is about kind of balancing some of these perspectives and also just, you know, taking with a lot of care these relationships. So I feel that when I was creating Seguimos Caminando, and then the work that came afterwards with Familias Separadas, with the installations that I did in the capital of Pennsylvania, it was really about centering the mother stories, as I mentioned, right? To be able to provide, I think as artists, we're able to really provide at times a more profound message or profound connection that sometimes gets lost, right, within the urgency of change that needs to happen. And so I feel that, you know, the role of organizers, the role of legal teams, the role of educators, they're all necessary, as well as what we can bring in as artists, right? When we speak to creating monuments, or the absence of monuments, or the fact of, if we really think about our bodies as monuments, right? And the act of gathering, the act of sharing and connecting, those are things that I feel like as artists, we're able to bring to the table and to the conversation. So I think it's acknowledging that and seeing, okay, you know, in the case of the Shut Down Burks Coalition, their target, and still continues to be, our governor, right? And the Burks commissioners, to shut down this county-run prison. And to take out, you know, to share that information, and to take action. And so I find it as a way of like, okay, through the flowers, which, by the way, makes a beautiful connection back to my grandmother, right? And what I experienced, is that, you know, utilizing these flowers, and also thinking about how many hands it took to make them, right? And to assemble them, to put them together collectively, is in a sense like a visual representation of us coming together at this moment. And so I think also strategizing, when does a public work of art go up? When do we present it? When does it come down? When do we gather around it? Those are all what I've learned through organizers, is really how are we being strategic, right, in the messaging, and how can we connect, right? Like I mentioned, you know, the nuance of the story, and the really direct action that needs to take place.
Yeah, and I mean, I think just to also say, you know, sometimes like the work that we do is in the realm of the symbolic. It uses performance, you know, it has ritual to it. Everyone who put down those panels of paper flowers, you know, wore white. When we've done our cleanse projections, outside of like kind of official permission, like we have a kind of like our own practices. And I also understand how that's in tension with substantive change, you know. And I think sometimes we may hear like something, oh, that's just performative, or that's symbolic. And of course, for the work of artists, that's the register that we have. And so I think rather than seeing it as an either or, like it's either going to be symbolic or substantive, understand that it is a little bit of a kind of humility. Like you can do this, as you said, you have an intention, but you can coordinate, you can have coalition. You don't have to wait till the moment that things are heated up. You actually have to build relationships over time and figure out what are the right ones at the table. You know, I also was just thinking about, you know, part of going back to that question of like, why do we do why do I do what I do? I'm blown away constantly by the fact that status quo thinking, even by very well-intentioned folks, like is such a default. Like, oh, this is the way we make art. Oh, this is the way that we make laws. Oh, this is the way we make change. And I often just think, well, what if you switch gears and switch perspectives? It's like, who is initiating what is possible, what is necessary, what's vital? You know, I think a lot about the Monument Lab fellows around the country and Monument Lab artists who, you know, before there were headlines in the last year or last 3 years around monuments coming down, like they were like, hey, let me tell you about what's going on my block. Let me tell you what's happening in my city.
Yeah.
And, you know, I saw the great Betty Lee Craft in the comments, great Philadelphia artist, say Philly is committed artists, but I give that shout out to all over the place, that artists with often very little and limited resources, those who have even fewer, like do a lot with it and hold space. So I think about all those headlines that hit around the country over the last year plus that said, city takes down monument. And I'm like, okay, let's see the hidden footnotes here is, well, these group of artists, these group of students, these groups of organizers campaign to make this a reality. And guess what? after it's done, they're going to be the ones who are going to hold space, who are going to imagine anew. And so just, I think like part of the work that we do, because I know that you and I, when we're planning, we can go down to the details. I don't know if it's my Virgo moon or other energies that we bring. Like, it's a joy to work with you because process matters as much as outcome. But we know the purpose of what we're doing, and we have to call things off and we have to act fast. But it's all about, there is another way. It doesn't have to be the way it's always been. And frankly, if you want a different result and you're doing things the same way, you will get the same thing, right? And just figuring out process as part of the work of art, the work of organizing, the work of imagining.
Yeah, I mean, I think that and you know, there's I think there's value in artists that take immediate action, and then artists that do take their time, right? And I think that that's where it's figuring out when, right? And having that balance. And I do want to talk about cleanse, because I want to have that moment to really speak to the two projections that we did during the quarantine. Well, when in, you know, our first year in quarantine. And so in particular, we would talk about like memory and space and engaging in that space, and just to kind of give folks some context around our first projection, which happened not that far, like 3 blocks away from where I live, was the Frank Rizzo mural, and also which came down and was painted over at the same time that his statue was also removed in Center City in the municipal, in front of the municipal building. And I also know that, you know, with Monument Lab, from what I was remembering too, was in 2017, if not earlier as well, there were folks speaking to the removal of the Frank Rizzo statue. So before all of these monuments were coming down, there was already conversations about the removal of this image. Frank Rizzo, and I can say I grew up here in this community, which when I was growing up was predominantly Italian community. And so Frank Rizzo, what I was taught was that he was a mayor that made it, that was a hero. He was the first Italian-American mayor in Philadelphia. And so he also came from South Philadelphia. And so in the environment that I grew up in, I was taught that we were to, you know, consider him a hero. And it wasn't until I was older, you know, as a young adult, that I found out his association with the MOVE bombing and years and years of violence, specifically towards Black and Brown, but mostly Black communities within our city, and his legacy of violence, right? And so we rewind to June 2020 at the height of the protest with the continued movement for racial justice happening throughout our entire country. And that then hit a point where the statue was eventually removed by the city, somewhere in hiding. We don't know where it is, I guess. I don't know if you know where it is, Paul.
No,
and
gone.
The mural was erased. So in this clip that I'm about to show you, you will see a little portion of the mural being removed. But I remember that mural being painted when I was 17 years old. And it has stayed there, and it is a very small representation of the contributions of Italian immigrant families and community within our city. And so what I have said, and our response to the projection was really, which, you know, the Clip Collective was one of the folks participating in this first, and actually in both projections, and lend their skills in doing the projections. But Ricardo Rivera was like, I just want to blow up the wall with light, right? And he's one of the founders of the Clip Collective. But I thought that metaphor was really interesting. Like, he literally was just saying, like, let's just blast it with light. But I thought, oh, in the midst of this darkness and this dark history and this really weight, like felt this like strong weight of just layered and layered just racial history, like racist history that really was personified in this image. You know, Rizzo loved his community but didn't love everyone else. And so in this moment of the erasure of this mural was really about a month later responding to that and really capturing the importance of representing the people in the community. And so the people of the community, meaning the folks in the market, the people who work in the market. And I think that the other conversation too, which we probably won't have enough time to talk to, but I'll hint to, you know, the process in which what is going to be placed at the municipal building in Center City in it to replace the image, the Frank Rizzo statue in Center City is a different process in when we think about this mural embedded in a specific community, in a specific neighborhood, right? And so what I'm about to show you was a projection that we did that evening that we did with many artists, which I'll share in a second. And then the second projection we can speak to after, which was around at Bartram's Gardens a few months later. Sorry about that, trying to get back here.
Yeah, thank you for sharing those, Michelle. I just have a few reflections I just want to put out there, and of course hear back from you. And then I know Jaleesa is going to rejoin us shortly to have some questions from all of you. Just on a few of those notes, I mean, one, also just like as an appreciation of all the images that you showed, like your family is in these as well. So just like appreciating that and understanding, like for so many artists, whether you know it or they acknowledge it or not, like their people are present or they're present. So I just want to acknowledge that. You know, I'm thinking about the story of Frank Rizzo, and there might be, you may know his story, you may not, but there's a Frank Rizzo in almost every city. someone whose story publicly is one of celebrating law and order, generally for white residents. But that law and order is at the expense of the civil rights, the well-being of communities of color, of marginalized communities, of queer people. And so, you know, I think part of what hit us when we were doing this project, which was without a budget other than ones like pulled together in an ad hoc way, outside of the permission of the city. A lot of projects we do take years and years of permissions, but this was much more kind of neighborhood based, with some close coordination with the property owners. But the story of Frank Rizzo being enshrined as part of the official narrative of the city, you'd hear the city members of leadership in the city say like, yep, he does not represent us. Yep, we should take his statue down. Yep, we'll do a public process where we'll gather all of this input and then tell you it will be removed. And then years were going by where nothing was happening. And I think it really took the protest movement, especially I think of organizers around the city, especially organizers of color. I think about long before Monument Lab, Avenging the Ancestors Coalition, Real Justice Philadelphia, in concert with projects like Hank Willis Thomas's All Power to All People, that pushed to the point of no return where the city had to say, oh, nope, we're gonna take this down, both statue and mural. But where we intervened was the sense that, well, what's next? There's a failure of imagination. It is not only in the moment where we need imagination to get us through, it was a moment where the city's art office was zeroed out and ceased to exist, in the mayor's words. And so we felt as artists, what could we do? And I think this, this notion of projection, you can add a new story to the city. It may not be the only story. It's not about having the only story. It's about saying that our goal was to cleanse that space. And whether it was just for us, whether it was for other people, to have images that counter those that are violent, those that are frozen in time, those that are exclusive. And so I think, part of like the goal we said, because, this was not an event like we were trained to do. We could not ask lots of people to go. Just another thing that, Michelle, we didn't talk about here, but I remember that in a few blocks away, there was there still is a Christopher Columbus statue that's under a box right now with the city saying it will be removed. It hasn't been removed yet. And a rumor went around that that statue was going to come down without a city process, and armed white neighborhood residents were shouting racist epithets and like going and guarding it armed and going to the mayor's house. And again, this is something that a lot of communities have faced over the years. And so for us, a few blocks away from that, we wanted to express and create, but we knew that there are real ramifications of doing that. So I think just a key, whether it is projection, whether it is activation, it is really important. And I know Michelle has pieces, and we've worked on pieces that are long-standing, that live for a long time. I won't say permanent, because there's no such thing as permanent public art. There are things that are kept up because of maintenance money and mindsets. But there is enduring work. There is long-standing work. There's deep work. But I think in that moment, we sensed that we wanted another chapter for the city. And likewise around COVID, which was the next chapter, really recognizing that we needed space to grieve. We needed a space to register loss. We needed a space to celebrate the kind of resistance against the odds. And that part of the goal of that was just to create images that would circulate. Part of that would create, it could not undo that which was done, but it could be just even a place to acknowledge and register that we need that space to create, to heal and to cleanse.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much, and I'm gonna try to also just bring another level of perspective on this and my own experience around this as well. Like I felt like that evening that we did the piece, actually both projections felt like a prayer. and I feel that the artist in the first cleanse, we had myself as well as Laura Deutsch, Naomi Joven, Kevin Wynn, who's also an artist that has been born and raised and lives like a block away from me in this community, Ricardo Rivera, and Ursula Rucker's beautiful poems that were brought to life and animated by Gabrielle Patterson. And so the all of these artists was just like, okay, who do we know? How can we connect? And I think the creation of Cleanse really came from this like call. It was like our call to action. I hadn't left my house in months, right? And that became that moment of just like, okay, we're not applying for a grant. We're not going in through this like really intense process as Paul had mentioned, but what do we have at our reach? What can we offer? What are our resources, and how we can not just join our skills together, but also build on the relationships that we've already established within our spaces. And so in particular to that first projection, unfortunately, the way that I see the racial tension that has really not just bubbled up, because it's always existed in our city and in our nation, but specifically in my community, it's not surprising to me, because I grew up here. I grew up in Philly in the 1980s and 90s. I grew up in this neighborhood knowing that even though I was a light-skinned Latina, folks reminded me that they did not want me here or my family here, right? And so having the opening scene of my mother's hands with the clean water is also giving homage to her and her 25 years of emotional and physical labor in the market, because she worked in the market for 25 years. And this idea of like the cleansing of the water, cleansing that space. And then one of the final images, at least in my projection, was the image of my husband holding my son. And so how is that paired with this legacy of this mayor who had inflicted so much violence in Black communities? And how am I counteracting that with an image of a Black man caring and showing love to his child, right? And not being a victim, and not being portrayed or representing how he is a victim of this racism and white supremacy in the United States. And so I think having these moments, even in our second projection, so in the second projection, we had the artist Chanel Edwards, Lila Isha, Raymond Holdman Jr., who had been documenting and taking photos of doctors, Black doctors and nurses during COVID, right? And representing that, and also documenting the Black Lives Matter protests that were happening in our city. And so we placed the images in Bartram's Gardens with the landscape of our city behind, right? As this representation of just the value of life. So not just thinking about the pandemic of COVID, but the other pandemic, which is, this racist country that continues to take the lives of Black and Brown people, right? And so who are the artists that we know, right? In a sense, like what I loved about Cleanse is that I participated as an artist, but then also having conversations with Paul, with Lori, with some of the other collaborators in thinking about content and messaging, and inviting other artists in that process to speak to that. But I feel like Cleanse was definitely, because we weren't restricted with a grant, because we weren't necessarily there wasn't like a huge long process. It really felt at the time where we were all living under these these issues that still are relevant to us all now. The projection gave flexibility. It also, we streamed it live on Instagram, and we were able to reach out to other audiences that weren't able to be there. And like I mentioned, for the people that were there, it was a moment of just gathering and reflecting, which I think is very much needed when we are consistently just being bombarded with information through social media, through what we see around us, right? Having that moment of pause and just acknowledging not just what we've been through, but like, how do we also acknowledge our own inner strength and spirit in the midst of that and in that connection?
Thank you both, Paul and Michelle. I just wanted to jump in here and first off, welcome and invite audience questions, but also to kind of further extend what you both were just talking about in terms of projections and thinking about monuments and the duration of monuments. There are a few audience questions that are sort of lingering around that idea of, well, why projections, and if especially within the current moment of a lot of monuments coming down, what goes up in its place? A new monument? And within that, I would like to fold in some thoughts of my own, or like a question really. Just thinking about reflecting on the disrupting the status quo that you talked about, Paul. In the work that's being done right now, both in your work, Michelle, and then in like larger Monument Lab work, how is that conversation taking place around, how do we address these monuments that have come down and what may or may not go up in its place? Rethinking, is it even necessary to have something come back up? And if it does, is it projection work? Does it have a temporal nature to it? And what is the value in that?
I think part of what, appreciate the question, I see a number of the comments here. And I think like one of the biggest thing I want to put out there is because of the legacy of public spaces and public representation that have been so toxic, so limited, have often reinforced violence and land theft and harsh systems, that it feels like a zero-sum game. Like, is this the perfect path? And I think like part of what I've experienced in working closely with artists, working closely with a lot of folks, is there are so many tools out there. And rather than seeing like you either keep them all up or you tear them all down, actually figure out where you stand. So like, first of all, because I see a question about this, there are people, we've had Monument Lab fellows who have, this was a few years ago, but like pulled down a statue, and like that was what they did, and that was their method, because they believe that a white toxic lost cause memorial at the University of North Carolina, this is a group called Take Action Chapel Hill, could not stand anymore. We have other folks in our fold who say, all the attention that gets put back on this idea of monument, that it must be built up. Our fellow in Richmond, Virginia, Free Bangura, says like she calls them Gilded Age trophies, and she'd much rather you focus your time and energy on the African burial ground than Shako Bottom in Richmond. She has a lot to say about Monument Avenue and has been working with, organizing, and supporting on the side a lot of youth-led activists on the scene. But she says, look, I've been working for the last decade plus on this project, and part of, even in the last few days, the city has announced that part of their efforts are also going to be going off of this really traumatized site. So I think, and the other thing I'm just thinking about from your question, Jaleesa, is, we're in the midst of this monument audit, gathering as much data as we can about monuments. I have to say, like, monument is not a pure category. It's not actually something that actually exists. It is a thing that we call certain things monuments, but every state defines them differently. They are not permanent. They are products of time. They have the aura of permanence. And while we call the projects we do, including Seguimos Caminando, a prototype monument, we do that to call attention to the fragility of them. The fact that if we did not invest money in them, they would crumble. And so I think part of the work, and Michelle, you hit this so beautifully, like it is about urgency and it's also about reflection. And therein lies the challenge for us. How do we broaden the scope of what's possible? How do we, I'm seeing this as a question, like, I'd really love to know what the experience of anonymous activists has been and what they see. I think about also I'm interested in hearing from public art officials and trying to, something we've done over the years is like tell those folks who are trying to make change they're not alone. They often are in systems that are constantly pushing against them, but like how do they rethink their budgets, their conservation logic, their partnerships in and out of city government to like figure out when they should be in the way moving and when do they get out of the way for other folks. So like my hope is that we would come out of this period recognizing that monuments are not permanent, monuments are made to change, and that we need all the tools we can to shape, we're catching up with ourselves across generations, and to think about monuments, as a meeting point. That being said, we have to also do the work of explaining how toxic they've been and what they've contributed to as a part of the larger reckoning.
Yes. And another question that's come up from an audience member, and I'm sort of like piggybacking off of these audience questions because they spur these larger conversations. But one audience member asked what permissions had to be secured for the projections on City Hall. And, I would love to extend that question into thinking about, like, Michelle, your work as an artist and making these public works, what it's like, or how you navigate, being a connector, a connection point between working with community, working with activists in community, working with the infrastructure of, the city government structure, and trying to make sure that there's support around these public works.
Yeah, there are little kids playing outside, so I muted myself. So, but I'm listening intently. I want to actually say really quickly about that first projection that we did in our neighborhood. There hasn't been anything placed on that wall, and one thing that is, I think, important as well is just letting these spaces breathe, right? And so not. And again, the reflection is not just about that moment. We were able to present another perspective, even if it was just that 1 hour for that one evening. And I think that contributes to the concept of reimagining. Sometimes we just need to present something different for people to think differently, perceive the space differently, interact with the space differently. So it's still blank, right? And that's fine if people have been interacting it with a different way. In terms of, navigating through these systems, I did this installation in front of the ICE building, which, if I can bring up the visual, that I can actually share this really quickly. And so I just want to speak to this because this is a good representation of thinking about, so this installation was created in front of the Immigration Customs Enforcement building in 2015, in front, as ICE agents were looking down on us. We had 30 volunteers that were legal advocates, organizers, as well as undocumented families that were laying down the words of an undocumented mother. And so her words, and a 90-foot long installation in front of the exit point where loved ones, this is the first point of detention, where then loved ones are then transported to jails and prisons to continue to fight against their detention, their deportation. And so it's a critical moment because, as I mentioned, we had families there. And so how important it was to have the permission, or the safety, right? So one thing is that I have the vision, and then the other thing is, okay, if I'm engaging the undocumented families to participate in this process, and we're in front of the ICE building, which they run the risk of being held or detained, I need to ensure that they're safe. And so there were a couple of things. This is where I say, within the relationships and looking at the resources that already exist, not just, so I think of the community members, the organizers, and then identifying who are our allies inside, right? So at City Hall, at the Capitol in Harrisburg, who are the allies that can help us say, okay, if you go this route, this will help you. So in that particular case, and just using that as a solid example, in Philadelphia, if you were to place a work on the sidewalk, you would need permission from a wall owner, which would have been ICE. That they wouldn't have given us permission. But if we do it in the street, you would only need the permission from a mayor and a streets commissioner. So during that time, I was like, okay, this piece was highlighted through the Mural Arts program, through their open source exhibition. So Mural Arts has received some city funding. They were able to make some connections on the inside, as well as the organizers that already had established some allies in the city. And we were able to finally be at the table with the streets commissioner and saying, okay, we want to do this. And so even to the very end, like the installation happened on Monday, on Indigenous Peoples Day, and Friday is when we got the yes to do it, but I had already bought all the materials. So there is a sense of having faith that things are going to happen. But then at the same time, you know, when I speak to intention, right, I'm also understanding who it is that I'm speaking to, right? So while I'm speaking to organizers and activists, they want to know, how is this going to help their advocacy? How is this going to help their campaigns? If I'm speaking to the city, I'm going to say, okay, why is this meaningful in our city? Who is it speaking to? Who is it representing? And how is this going to be safe? Some of the logistical, just basic things of installation time, who's going to be there. So that's how I was able to work on that. But that took about 4 weeks, sometimes months, of identifying allies on the inside to be able to figure out and navigate through these systems. I see it, and because I'm a painter at heart, right? I see it as what I tell people is that artists are problem solvers, right? So like when we have a blank canvas and we're thinking about what our vision is, and then that evolves and maybe changes or shifts, or a brushstroke or a full wipe down, like we have to have that patience and determination with our work. I'm not inventing anything new. I'm basically utilizing those tactics that I have as an artist and implementing them within these systems to figure out a way to maintain really that story and the integrity of that story, right? And that's the other thing. Sometimes it does mean walking away and saying no. And then there's these moments that this happens where, you know, these families who would never step foot in front of this building, or we're all coming together to place these beautiful words in the midst of the threat looking down on us, right?
Even in thinking about those moments, because well, this sort of ties into a comment that someone had left in the Q&A, but even in thinking about those moments when, you know, you come together around a project and the decision is no, you know, like you said, sometimes those moments of like, okay, we shouldn't go through with this, or this isn't going to work, really trying to think about it within this mindset of, well, the artwork did or did not happen, but that the whole process, like really trying to, in a way, dematerialize the art making process. And I think that kind of nods to this like last comment that's in the Q&A about the erasure between, oh no, something else just popped up, but I'll get to that in a second. But the erasure between art and life in different Indigenous communities. And I was just wondering if, Michelle, if you'd be interested, because I see that beautifully in terms of the flowers that you talked about, that's a practice that was a part of life, but is also an art, you know, and if you could talk a little bit more about how you're engaging with that on a regular basis in your practice, and even extend that question out to Paul, because I imagine that a lot of other artists and even the work that's being done, the thinking in Monument Lab, is there's a value, or like there's something in there in trying to tease apart this line between us just being here alive and trying to exist and trying to help each other, and then also creating something very beautiful, something meaningful, something that, as you had mentioned, Michelle, captures the nuances of humanity.
I mean, I think that I I am someone that I always have very present my ancestors and spirit, and I always speak to actually one of the podcast we did, Paul, for Monument Lab. I spoke to this concept that I feel like we're all like these little fireflies that, you know, we all carry this light, and sometimes the way that I see my work, opening a space for somebody to share their story and to feel that their story is really being heard and that we're connecting, in a sense, like makes their light shine brighter. And I feel that that is so necessary in this world that and these systems that want to criminalize us, that want to pin us against each other, that want to diminish our value, right? How that simple act of, I want to speak up, and we're here to support you, we want to hear you, um, is so important, right? And that is the part that doesn't always get seen in the big like public art production, right? And we've done murals and huge installations, and those are the moments that I am bearing witness to, that really feed into the inspiration of my work, right? That even though I have to deal with the streets commissioner and the mayor and all of these meetings, like it really comes down to that moment, right? And you know, and I feel like spirit is huge. Like when we did the projection in Bartram's Gardens, like I say, yes, near the river, right? And the representation of the river as La Virgen de Caridad, Oshun, beauty and love and wellness. And so if we're speaking to the value of life, if we're speaking to, I have an Afro-Latino child and protection, right? Like what is that symbolism of place, right? And where we are sharing those messages. But I feel that, you know, there's these moments, as I mentioned, of just like revealing this light and supporting that light. And then there's other moments that I honestly feel like when we get the work done, like when we finish that installation in front of the ice building, it felt for me a machete that I'm throwing in the midst of this system, right? It is this act of like defiance, right? And it is an act of, you will not erase us, you will not silence us. And that collective power, bearing witness to that collective power, right? So the installations and the is not really, I feel like the only success, right? Completing an installation. It is the energy around creating the work, which I feel is really powerful in that moment. And for the artists that do this, right? Like what I love is that, especially last year and last summer, all of those street murals that were going across the United States, right? Of, you know, folks getting that yellow paint and different colors. And I was like, yes, I was like, I'm so happy that this is happening, because I know what that feeling is of being in community, of coming together, and marking, you know, kind of claiming space, and how important that is when we're still fighting, right? And creating those moments of acknowledging our light and celebrating our resilience in the middle of all of this.
That was very beautiful. And then, okay, so this is the last question. We'll wrap up from here. And this is from an audience member. First off, thanks for this conversation, so great. And they wrote, I have been thinking about how we bridge personal and community histories with the monumental, in quotes, narratives of common status quo histories. Is it about dismantling the status quo history in favor of community ones? A lot of the Monument Lab work seems to address both, and would love to hear you understand and work with those connections between the two and how that may be discussed within communities.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm really glad this was recorded because I can go back and listen to Michelle's answer and just appreciate both what you said, but how you carry it, how you bring that to every project, whether we're working together, I'm seeing it online, you know, I'm thinking about your Fiera Studios. If you go to Michelle's website, you can see, you can get swag with it, but it's serious. It's the image, if I'm correct, is the paintbrush and the machete. And the work of art is not just art for art's sake or art as luxury. Art is the way through. Art is the light, and art is also, you know, this web of connectivity. I think just so the question, I really appreciate that question. And I want to, again, kind of extend this idea that there is not one answer. And, you know, thinking about process, the monumental histories that we have inherited are not equaling our history. You know, I think you hear this phrase of like, well, you know, if you take down a monument, it gets rid of history. Let me tell you, if you want to know the history of a place, you Google it, you go to the library, you look for books, you look for documentaries. You do not rush to go find a plaque and read that thing. We know history doesn't happen because some dude rolls into town on a horse and looks off in the distance. And yet we settle for that as if history lives inside of it. And I think if anything, like whether it's the work of Monument Lab or the work of people I really admire doing the work, are in part creating new symbols, but they're also reckoning with like the way we got here. And the way we got here was attempting to tell single stories meant to reflect those who had disproportionately more power, and utilize symbols as a way to reinforce systems of power. And so I think in part, the framing of like the monuments we've inherited versus the next generation of monuments. Well, the monuments we've inherited, I don't want to continue to put more resources into maintaining them than we have to, but I'm interested in knowing what we have, but to really understand how they got there. Like there's, you know, I think about Lost Cause Confederate monument in Baltimore that was removed by the city after protests occurred. Protests happened, and that statue went in 1947. Memphis had Jefferson Davis statue put in 1964. The Frank Rizzo statue that we're talking about in Philadelphia was put in 1998. Like for basketball fans out there, that's when Allen Iverson was playing in the league. This is not ancient history. It is not. I think part of the language of like monuments is permanent. We actually want to understand how it got there. William Penn on the top of Philadelphia City Hall is not a product of the colonial times. That's a product of more modern times, of the early 1900s. That being said, you know, something I didn't say before, but I also want to like, I understand why there are people who want to utilize older monumental forms for representation, because for so long, the idea of who deserved a monument was disproportionately white, male, property, cis, het, you know, and that I understand why a community would want a bronze memorial to an underrepresented figure or story. I think for every monument that's in the spotlight right now, there are hundreds, if not thousands, that are kind of sitting in place in neighborhoods. And sometimes they are treated and beloved, and you'll find little like touchstones or altars around them. A lot of times they kind of languish there. Someone thought that was important to do. So I think like part of the thought process here, and I appreciate what Michelle's saying around the artistic energy, is this idea that we're not looking. Yes, we do need to look for particular monuments that are pernicious, that are toxic, especially where they are placed. But we're not. This is not trying to find the problematic one, plucking it and moving on, like removing the bad apple from the batch, as if the batch doesn't produce and reproduce systems of violence and toxicity. So I think if the challenge here is a matter of scale, if we sought to, if we were putting a lot of resources into changing all the monuments we've inherited, I would say, wait, why are we putting all the money into doing that? We really should just be unearthing new stories. And if you leave all of the symbols intact and just try to add new ones, it's like, wait, why are we letting that thing be here? So it really requires a caring kind of process that is urgent and reflective, and says we might not have the answer for everything, but let's figure out what's going on right here. What are people already saying? What are people already doing? How do people offer care around it? And then I think we really have to get at our mindsets. And if our mindsets are, again, I think, you know, the word monument sounds so official. It is something that has been utilized both as a forceful tool of power against people, and also is the kind of thing that if you don't have the time, the money, or the official power, you build a monument, you call it a monument, you gather next to a monument and re-event it. And I think that appreciating that as part of our monumental landscape may be a path forward for us.
Thank you. That is a really, really beautiful note to end on. I just want to thank you, Paul, and thank you, Michelle, for this very rich conversation. It's really, I know that a lot of the audience, or all of the audience really, really appreciated the conversation, especially as, you know, here in Portland, we're thinking a lot around our work in regards to our monuments. So thank you for sharing with us, and thank you everybody for coming through to support this conversation.
We're so grateful to you, Jaleesa, and to everyone continuing, and we hope to keep in touch. So make sure you follow Michelle Angela Ortiz, follow Monument Lab, and and be in touch with us, and keep doing what you're doing. We look forward to crossing paths and just sending light to everybody today.